Look, I'll just go ahead and say it. Auto ISO is not manual. Disagree with me? Let's talk about it on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions right here on Adorama TV. If you've got a photo question, you certainly know what to do by now. Just go to askdavidbergman.com, submit that form on the site, and I just might pick your question to answer right here on a future show. Today's question was sent in by Mark T, and he wants to know, hey David, I've heard a lot of photographers say they shoot in manual but use auto ISO. I like the idea of setting my shutter speed and aperture while letting the camera adjust ISO for me, but does that still count as shooting in manual? And when should I use auto ISO versus full manual? Thanks, Mark, for sending that in. This happens to be a big pet peeve of mine, so I'm really happy to talk about it. First, let's talk about what auto ISO actually is. Now, as you probably know, there are three settings that you use to set the exposure of your photos: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, the exposure triangle as it's called, and they control how bright or dark your images are. The shutter speed is how long your digital sensor is exposed. The slower your shutter speed, the more light hits that sensor, the brighter your image. And making your shutter speed faster means less light hits that sensor, so your image is going to be darker. Now, aperture is how wide your lens opens when the sensor is exposed. The wider it opens, the more light comes through, the brighter your image. And of course, a smaller opening makes your images darker. Now, ISO is a bit different. And by the way, it is pronounced ISO, not ISO. I've talked about it in other videos, so I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but you're just going to have to trust me for now. ISO, as I said, is a bit different because it doesn't physically change the amount of light that hits your sensor like shutter speed and aperture do. After the light is captured on the sensor, the ISO setting is applied and the camera's processor adds a little voltage boost to brighten the image. The higher the ISO number, the brighter the image. It's kind of like adjusting the brightness slider in Photoshop or Lightroom, but it's higher quality because it happens earlier in the analog to digital conversion process, and the camera manufacturers know how to manipulate their own files better than third parties do when they have to reverse engineer those raw files. Now, the three exposure triangle settings work together to determine how bright or dark your image is. If you adjust one, you might need to compensate with another to get your exposure where you want. For example, if you decide to open up your aperture all the way so that you get a really beautiful shallow depth of field, that's going to let in more light and might make your photo too bright. To darken it, you can speed up your shutter speed or lower your ISO to balance things out. Now, there are also creative reasons to set those settings, and I've done videos about all three that I'll link to down in the description if you want a little refresher. Now, there are some automatic modes that the camera has to make things a bit easier if you don't want to manually set everything. Of course, there's full program, which might be the setting that you used the very first time you picked up a camera. It basically sets everything for you, and you really have no say in what happens. But then there are these semi-automatic modes called aperture priority and shutter priority. Aperture priority is usually labeled AV for aperture value, and shutter priority is TV for time value. Whichever one you select gives priority to that setting. So if you decide that you want to shoot with your aperture wide open to get that nice shallow depth of field, use aperture priority. That allows you to set your aperture at whatever you want, and the camera won't change it. So in this case, you might set it wide open at like 2.8 or wider, depending on the lens you're using, and the camera will automatically compensate by changing the shutter speed. Shutter priority works the same way, where you set the shutter speed and the camera decides the correct aperture. Now, how does the camera decide what the correct exposure is? Well, it's reading the light that's hitting the sensor, and generally speaking, it's trying to average everything out so your photos aren't too bright or too dark. Now, there are a number of other factors and adjustments you can make that affect that camera's judgment, like metering modes, exposure compensation, and even things like face detection. But the bottom line is that the camera is making the decision for you, and it could change from frame to frame, even if you're shooting fast bursts of images. Now, aperture priority and shutter priority have been around since the 1960s and 70s. Of course, those were back in the film days, and film had a fixed sensitivity known as ASA and was later standardized as ISO in 1974. You had to pick your film before you even started shooting, and you could get film speeds, you could buy it at speeds like 25, 50, 100, and 200. 400 ASA was considered high speed at the time, which is kind of crazy to think about. The thing is, you couldn't really change mid-roll unless you wanted to just lose the rest of the frames and put in a new roll. Once your film was in, you really only had aperture and shutter speed to control your exposure. But in the digital age, you can change ISO anytime you want. The range was pretty limited in the early digital camera days, but the technology gets better every year. Today, we can shoot at 100 ISO on one frame and 10,000 ISO on the next. Cameras have had aperture priority and shutter priority for decades, but in those modes, ISO was always fixed. It stayed at whatever you set it to. That could be a problem if, for example, you were shooting in very low light and the camera lowered your shutter speed so much that you started to have motion blur. It could slow down to a fraction of a second or even longer in really dark situations, making it impossible to handhold without blur. The camera doesn't really care about that. It's just trying to bring in enough light for a good exposure. So that is where auto ISO comes in. As technology improved, camera manufacturers introduced auto ISO as another way to control exposure. Instead of just adjusting shutter speed or aperture, the camera can also change ISO to help balance exposure and prevent extreme settings that could ruin a shot. You're basically giving the camera permission to adjust ISO as needed. The cool thing is that you can set limits to keep the camera from going too far in either direction. Most cameras allow you to set a maximum ISO so it won't push too high and introduce too much noise in your images. You can also set a minimum shutter speed to prevent that motion blur issue. If you're shooting in low light and don't want your ISO to go past 3200, for example, you can set that as your limit. Or if you're shooting handheld and don't want your shutter speed to drop below, let's say 125th of a second, you can tell the camera to stop at that point. Once it hits one of those two limits, it won't go any further and it's going to adjust the other setting instead. Now, this can really be useful when shooting fast-moving subjects or in environments where the lighting changes quickly. So, Mark, you asked about shooting in manual with auto ISO. Technically, when you set your camera to M mode and use auto ISO, the camera does call it manual mode, but that's really just referring to the dial position. It allows you to lock both the aperture and shutter speed, but your exposure is still being adjusted automatically with the changing ISO. So I'm just going to go ahead and say it. Auto ISO is not manual exposure. It literally has auto in the name. True manual exposure is when you set all three settings, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. When you do that, you are controlling the exposure of your image. Even though you can set some limits with auto ISO, you've mostly given up control of your exposure to the camera. Personally, I shoot in full manual 99.9% of the time because I want to have that level of control. I want to decide if my images should be bright and punchy or dark and moody. That's part of the creative process and contributes to making your look or your style. Now, Mark, you also asked when you should shoot in auto ISO versus full manual. Really? That's up to you. Even though I shoot in full manual, everyone is different and I don't judge. These cameras are really smart, so if the light is changing quickly and you just don't want to worry about manually adjusting your exposure on the fly, then go ahead and shoot with any auto mode that makes sense for you. I do have a video about how I deal with fast-changing concert lighting while shooting full manual, and I'm going to put a link to that down in the description. But at the end of the day, photography is a personal process, and the technology is there to help us. If you're getting the images that you want, then it really doesn't matter what settings you use to get there. What do you all think? Do you agree with me, or are you still going to call it manual even though you're using auto ISO? Let me know down in the comments below and we'll talk about it. Don't forget you can send in your own photo questions by going to askdavidbergman.com. If you like these videos, I do appreciate you hitting that like button and, of course, subscribing to the Adorama YouTube channel. Click that little bell icon so you're notified when new shows come out from me and all the hosts here on Adorama TV. Thanks so much for joining me and hope to see you next time right here on Ask David Bergman.